G'day guys, and welcome to Beat the Reset. My name is Tim and I am the guy in the hat. And today I wanted to talk to you about the X class of currencies and why they're important and why you should know about them. Before I get into that, allow me to introduce my new book, The Great Asset Shift. It's just been released, so if you are looking for a fabulous read about why the common man has been duped out of his assets over the last 250 years, The Great Asset Shift will take you on a very, very interesting journey. My original book, of course, was called Things We Were Never Told About Money. And these books are both available from my publisher, although you can actually order them direct from me. So if you'd like a couple of copies of these, let me know. I'll also throw in, of course, a fabulous little bookmark that has the Beat the Reset website on the back. But moving right along, the X class of currencies, what are they all about? How did we come to this? Well, first of all, I am a precious metals / commodities guy. I have my wealth stored in assets outside the system. These are the kind of assets that I like to store my wealth in because, of course, fiat currency, which is produced by central banks and largely governments as far as coinages goes, are largely unable to store wealth over long periods of time. So what you have to do is you have to use the very fiat currency that you are given by your governments and your central banks, and you use that in turn to buy commodities that can actually store wealth over time. This here is a 10-ounce fine silver XAG bar, and I'm specifically holding this XAG bar up because I want to talk to you about what this XAG is all about. That is largely going to be the topic of my conversation, and more specifically the X component. So AG on the periodic table is silver, AU is gold, PT is platinum, but it's really the X that I want to talk to you about today because this is a little bit of a game changer when it comes to confiscation, eminent domain, expropriation, or compulsory acquisition. So what does all that mean for you, the person in the street? Throughout history, if we have a look at the United States Constitution, specifically the Fifth Amendment, written into the United States Constitution was a small phrase that was speaking about eminent domain, which effectively means supreme power, giving governments supreme power to confiscate, in other words, to take away whatever assets they desire, provided they have a reason to do so, and also provided that they are willing to remunerate for those assets. Now, up until 1933, we never really saw that act that part of the act or that clause enacted. However, in 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt, under Executive Order 6102, did just that. During the gold confiscation of 1933, the eminent domain clause was enacted under the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution, and gold was largely confiscated from the common man, and bullion and coinage was brought back to the commercial banking system and remunerated for $20.67. That's all the government was willing to pay, was $20.67. Now, what this did is create an anomaly which became known as the exemption of numismatics. Now, that might all sound like a mouthful, but what that actually meant was that any collectibles, any fine art, any coins that were largely pre-1933 coins were considered to be collectible, and therefore they were not remunerated for $20.67, which was all the government was paying. They were remunerated for a lot more than that. So I guess the point is that since the government was only prepared to pay $20.67, it meant that if you were holding pre-1933 collectibles, the government couldn't confiscate them because they weren't going to give you any more than that. And constitutionally, they have to remunerate in an acceptable way. Well, anything that was under the value of the item that the consumer wanted. So, for example, if you had a rare collectible coin that was many thousands of US dollars and the government was only paying $20.67, well, of course you're not going to hand it back. However, if you were holding just simple ounces of gold at the time, yes, you would hand them back for $20.67 an ounce, which was an amount that was largely prescribed in the Gold Standard Act of 1900. So that was a fairly common price for gold of the period. Now, shortly after that, of course, it became illegal in the Gold Reserve Act of 1934. The government made it illegal for the common man to trade gold. That was in the January of 1934. And then it also in 1934 made it illegal for the common man to trade bullion. Coinage was okay. Coinage could be traded right up until 1968, but silver bullion specifically was essentially taken out of the circulation or the tradability of the common man. So I guess the reason I give you this information is to demonstrate that governments do actually act upon expropriation and compulsory acquisition, and they do have intentions during monetary crises, especially one as big as the one in the 1930s under the New Deal, which of course was spearheaded by Franklin D. Roosevelt. During the Great Depression, which lasted from 29 to 1939, the United States was going through a massive economic shift through its central banking systems, right the way through its monetary systems. I mean, we saw the creation of the Securities Exchange Commissions in 1933 and 1934, the FDIC, and many other modifications under emergency banking acts to the monetary system, which ultimately resulted not only in a world war in 1939, but also in the United States dollar being pegged to gold in 1944 at the wholesale level for 26 years, right up until 1971, when President Nixon removed the United States from the gold standard because, of course, countries like France were demanding that US dollar reserves, be actually traded for the gold and the underlying asset. The French didn't want to hold the US dollars anymore because they'd lost so much value since their inception in 1944. Or /1945, that they wanted to exchange the dollars for gold, something the United States was not prepared to do. So, of course, the United States left the Bretton Woods system in 1971 under Nixon, which was in the August of 1971. Now, the US dollar was quickly debased a couple of times. So soon afterwards, the US dollar was debased to from $35 an ounce to $38 an ounce in 1971, and then again to $42.22 in 1973. Now, the reason I'm telling you all of this is because this is where we saw the introduction of ISO 3166, ISO 4217 as well. This was in the 1974. So this is at a time, 1974 was a very, very interesting year for the United States because largely the US dollar was not trading as an asset-backed currency because, of course, the US left the gold standard in 1971. So largely it was a free-floating currency. It was no longer a unilateral agreement where countries around the world were required to trade US dollars. So it's a free-floating currency in 1974. And Kissinger, of course, was very quick to move the US dollar onto the oil standard, which he did, of course, with the Saudis in 1974 in exchange for kind of military assistance and aid in the Middle East. The US dollar was, of course, or oil became backed by the US dollar, if you like, or the US dollar became backed by oil. The Saudis largely traded oil all around the globe in US dollars. Something that has actually changed now. I mean, we're seeing the rise of the yuan and the renminbi in that particular space and the fall of the US dollar. I think we should see some serious fireworks with regards to oil on the 1st of the 1st, 24, of course, because that's when the Saudis will largely align themselves with the BRICS nations, and that is a whole other story. But getting back to 1974, something else happened, and we saw that the International Organization for Standardisation, which is an organisation that is a globalist organisation formed in 1947, just 2 years after the forming of the United Nations. The United Nations, of course, is a conglomerate of 193 member states. There's only two states that are not, or two countries that are not signatories to the United Nations. One of them is the Holy See, which is largely the Vatican. The other is the State of Palestine. So 193 member states created the United Nations, which of course was a reconstruction of the original League of Nations, which folded in 1939 at the start of the Second World War. So here we have a globalist organisation called the International Organization for Standards, formed in 1947, which is tasked with basically standardising everything on the globe. So they sit under the banner of the United Nations. It's very important that you understand that they are actually a United Nations subsidiary. So what the IOS, or the International Organization for Standardization, did in 1974 is it created its country codes, which was ISO 3166. Now, the country codes are not too nefarious. I mean, they're everything that you would expect them to be. US was United States, AU was Australia, JP was Japan, GB, Great Britain, and so on and so forth. But in 1974, they also introduced ISO 4217, which was the currency codes. Now, currency codes were constructed from both the ISO 4217 code and ISO 3166, and it kind of went a little bit like this. You took the country code from ISO 3166, which was, say, for example, US, And then you took the currency code from ISO 4217. So for example, the currency code for the US dollar was simply the letter D. The currency code for the yen was simply the letter Y. So this was very, very easy. So Japanese yen under currency codes became JP, which was from ISO 3166, and Y, which was from ISO 4217. So JPY, Japanese yen, US from ISO 3166, and the letter D from ISO 4217. So you had USD, AUD, and so on and so forth. But where it gets very interesting is when you look at ISO 4217 and you have a look at the X class of currencies. Now, the X class of currencies are very unique. They do not belong to any sovereign nation. Unlike the dollar, unlike the yen, unlike the pound, unlike the euro, the X class of currencies do not belong to any sovereign nation. Therefore, they are completely independent of any sovereign constitution, which means that this is a little bit of an eye-opener. And the question is, can X-class currencies be confiscated? That is a very, very interesting question. Right up until 1974 and prior to the ISO 4217 coming into being, it would have been numismatics and largely pre-1933 collectibles that are largely unconfiscatable. But it looks like that the United Nations, together with its subsidiary, the International Organization for Standardisation, created ISO 4217 X-Class with the specific purpose of creating a currency stream that was largely unconfiscatable by any sovereign nation, which means that the specific class that I'm talking about, and specifically because I'm a commodities guy, is XAG, XAU, and XPT. Now, let me give you a real-life example. Here is XAG. XAG simply stands for, well, AG stands for silver, and X comes from the currency class, which is ISO 4217. What this largely means, this particular silver bar, and on the back there's lots and lots of XAGs there. What this largely means, this 10-ounce piece of fine silver, which is 999 silver, is totally non-confiscatable under any eminent domain expropriation or compulsory acquisition. So this is completely unconfiscatable by governments. So what we have here is X stands for not associated with any, or it stands for an asset that is not associated with any sovereign nation. AG stands for silver. So we have a piece of currency that sits outside the jurisdiction or the constitutional rights of any sovereign nation, according to the United Nations. Now, the United Nations is not a government technically in itself. However, it's an extremely powerful globalist organization. So therefore, what we have is signatories, which are 193 countries which have signed up to the United Nations to accept the decree of the United Nations and its subsidiary bodies. So we have a subsidiary body which created in 1974, the X class of currencies. The X class of currencies are not confiscatable. That means that gold and silver and platinum, in their own right, by the letter of the code of ISO 4217, are totally non-confiscatable. This is something that was not possible prior to 1974. Prior to 1974, they could have been confiscated because constitutionally they came under the Fifth Amendment, eminent domain, expropriation in the UK, compulsory acquisition in countries like Australia. But now we find that it's not possible anymore. And this is a little known fact and something that I stumbled across recently and something that virtually no one in the world is actually talking about. So this is something you're going to see a lot more from on my channel. The Guy in the Hat's going to be presenting to you a little bit more to do with XAG, XAU, XPT, and so on. So if you are sitting currently in fiat currencies, which are largely being debased and collapsing as we speak, I mean, the US dollar has less than 2 cents buying power. Maybe what you want to consider is moving to commodities, monetary commodities. There are only really two monetary commodities, which is physical gold and physical silver. Gold is more the monetary commodity of reserve. Silver is the monetary commodity of trading. And this is totally non-confiscatable under ISO 4217. So this is very, very important and breaking information. Share this with as many people as you can. Share it far, share it wide, because it gives power back to the common man. And it means that for the first time virtually since 1933, the common man largely has got his commodity back within his possession. But unfortunately, not a lot of people would know that and may fall prey to the fear and the propaganda created under government confiscation confiscations and perceived confiscations. Anyway, that's it for me. The Guy in the Hat. Remember my two books that I mentioned earlier. The Great Asset Shift is my latest book. If you want a copy of that, let me know. It's a fantastic read. Just come out, just been released. And I also, of course, have my original book, Things We Were Never Told About Money. Just DM me if you'd like to get a copy of that, and I'll tell you exactly how you can go about it. I'll also throw in a brand new little bookmark. There it is. So that's it for me. The Guy in the Hat. I hope you learned something today. And remember, make good choices.